On a warm Saturday night in May 1977, over 3,000 people dressed in their finest clothes walked through the doors of the most glamorous nightclub in America. They were celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, graduations. Some were on first dates. Some had been married for 40 years and just wanted one perfect night out together. By midnight, 165 of them were dead. And the ones who survived never forgot the smell. The Beverly Hills Supper Club sat on a hilltop in Southgate, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati. And it wasn't just a restaurant, it was a statement. It was the kind of place where you made a reservation 3 weeks in advance, where the waitresses wore uniforms pressed to perfection, where the chandeliers caught the light just right, and where every single person who walked in felt, at least for a few hours, like they had made it. It had hosted Frank Sinatra, comedian after comedian, big band orchestras, political fundraisers. It was the crown jewel of the region, and the owners, the Schilling family, had spent years expanding it, adding room after room, corridor after corridor, until the place had grown into something almost impossible to fully understand from the inside. Over 500 employees, dozens of interconnected rooms, one building that had become, quietly, a maze. Nobody thought much about that. Why would they? This was the Beverly Hills Supper Club. Nothing bad happened here. That night, the headliner was John Davidson, a television personality beloved across America, the kind of performer who filled rooms with warmth and laughter. The cabaret room, the largest space in the club, held over 1,200 people, and it was packed well beyond what the fire code permitted. Tables crammed in wherever they fit, chairs pressed against chairs, people standing along the walls. The fire marshal's capacity limits existed somewhere in a filing cabinet, but they hadn't meant much for a long time. Outside, the evening air was still and humid. A typical Kentucky Saturday in late May. Inside, the band was warming up. What nobody in that room knew, what almost nobody in the entire building knew, was that at that exact moment, in a smaller banquet room called the Zebra Room, a small group of employees had just made a discovery. The wall was hot. Not warm. Hot. One of the busboys noticed it first. He pressed his hand against the wall and pulled it back fast. He found a manager. The manager found another manager. Someone opened a door they probably shouldn't have opened, and what they saw on the other side was already beyond saving. The fire had been burning for a while, quietly, invisibly, hidden inside the walls. This is the part that should make your stomach turn. Fires like this, fires that travel through the spaces between walls, through the gaps above ceilings, through the hidden architecture of a building, can burn for an extraordinarily long time before anyone sees a single flame. They consume everything structural first, the bones of the building, the parts you never see. And by the time they announce themselves, they have already decided the outcome. The Beverly Hills Supper Club had been renovated and expanded so many times, so quickly, often without proper permits, often without proper inspections, that its electrical wiring was a decades-long accumulation of shortcuts and oversights. Aluminum wiring, undersized circuits, connections that should have been replaced years ago. Every single expert who later examined what remained would agree. This building had been a fire waiting to happen, not a possibility, a certainty. The only question had always been when. The when was tonight. When the first employees tried to alert guests, they did it calmly. Too calmly, some would later say. So they didn't want to cause a panic. They walked into smaller rooms and said quietly that guests needed to exit the building. Some people grabbed their drinks, some argued, some laughed and assumed it was a drill or a mistake. A few got up immediately and walked out into the night, and those people lived. But in the cabaret room, where more than 1,200 people sat packed together, waiting for John Davidson to take the stage, the warning came late. Too late. And when it came in the form of a young cocktail waitress named Susan, who walked onto that stage, stood in front of that enormous crowd, and with genuine terror in her voice, told everyone they needed to leave right now. The room didn't quite understand what was happening, and then the lights went out. What happened next is difficult to describe without sitting in the reality of it. Darkness. Absolute darkness. Over 1,000 people, many of whom had been drinking. In an unfamiliar building they had never had reason to map in their minds, suddenly unable to see anything at all. The exits, and there were exits technically, were not clearly marked. The pathways were not clear. The tables and chairs that had been crammed in beyond capacity were now obstacles. And the smoke was already moving. Smoke is the thing people underestimate. It is not just suffocating, it is disorienting in a way that nothing else is. It removes your ability to think clearly, to navigate, to remember which direction you came from. People who have survived fires describe losing all sense of direction within seconds. Left becomes right. Forward becomes backward. The exit you are absolutely certain is ahead of you is actually behind you. And you don't find that out until it's too late. People fell. People were trampled. People grabbed the shoulders of strangers and followed them and hoped. Some people made it to exits and got out and stood in the parking lot and watched the building they had been inside 30 seconds ago begin to glow from within like a lantern. Some people did not make it to exits. Some people were found the next morning exactly where they had been sitting. The fire spread with a speed that the investigators would later call explosive. The ceiling materials, the wall coverings, the carpet, all of it burned fast and hot. The building that had been expanded so many times without adequate fire suppression systems, without sprinklers, without the kind of structural fire resistance that modern codes required, that building fed the fire everything it needed. By the time the first fire trucks arrived, the roof of the cabaret room had already collapsed. The firefighters who responded that night described a scene they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. People piled at exit doors that had become blocked. People who had made it halfway out and hadn't made it the rest of the way. The heat was so intense that firefighters couldn't enter certain sections of the building at all. They sprayed water into rooms they couldn't reach and hoped. One firefighter said years later that the worst part was the silence. That in the chaos of the hoses and the crackling and the shouting, there were pockets of silence from inside that building that told him everything he needed to know and that he never wanted to know. 165 people died that night. Many more were injured, burned, trampled, overcome by smoke. Hundreds of families drove to hospitals across the Cincinnati area in the hours that followed, looking for someone. Some of them found their person in a hospital bed. Some of them did not find their person at all. The investigations that followed were extensive and, to many people, infuriating. What emerged was not a story of a freak accident. It was a story of a system that had failed repeatedly over many years, in many different ways, and that nobody had fixed because nobody had wanted to be the person who shut down the most famous nightclub in the region. The electrical problems were well documented. The overcrowding was well documented. The lack of sprinklers, the inadequate exit signage, the construction work done without permits, all of it was known, or knowable, to the right people. Fire inspectors had visited. Reports had been written. Follow-ups had been scheduled and not followed through. The Schilling family had been adding rooms and expanding capacity for years, always staying just functional enough, always managing relationships well enough, always being a significant enough economic presence that scrutiny never quite hardened into action. This is not unique to 1977. This is not unique to Kentucky. This is the story of almost every preventable disaster in history, a long chain of small decisions, each one individually defensible, each one adding one more link to a chain that eventually breaks under its own weight. The survivors carried the night with them in ways that are impossible to fully convey. There are people who walked out of that parking lot in May 1977 who still cannot sit with their back to a door, who still count exits when they enter a building, who still, in restaurants and theaters and concert halls, feel the edge of something, a low-grade awareness that the building around them is not a guarantee, that is not paranoia, that is knowledge, hard knowledge, paid for at enormous cost, shared second-hand with everyone who would listen. The lawsuits that followed were massive. The legal proceedings stretched for years. Changes to fire codes across Kentucky and nationally were implemented in the aftermath of the Beverly Hills disaster, stricter sprinkler requirements, better exit signage standards, capacity enforcement with actual teeth. The club itself never reopened. The land sat and eventually became something else. But here is what stays with you about this story, if you let it. The Beverly Hills Supper Club was not a poorly regarded place. It was not a dive. It was not somewhere that people went reluctantly or felt uncomfortable. It was celebrated. It was beloved. The people who died there had chosen it for their most important nights. They had dressed up for it. They had been excited to be there. That is the particular cruelty of this story, the very qualities that made it attractive. The grandeur, the capacity, the sense of occasion were also the conditions that made it deadly. The success of the place had fed its growth. The growth had created the hazards. The prestige had protected it from scrutiny. And on a Saturday night in May, when over 3,000 people trusted that a building that felt safe was actually safe, the bill came due. Nature does not negotiate. Physics does not negotiate. Fire does not care how expensive the chandeliers were. There is a lesson in this that goes far beyond fire codes and building inspections. It is about what we assume, collectively, when something looks successful. We extend it a kind of trust that it may not have earned. We see the full parking lot and the famous names on the marquee and the well-dressed crowd, and we take all of that as evidence that someone, somewhere, has verified that everything is fine, that the systems are working, that somebody checked. Often, nobody checked. The names on the wall at the memorial in Southgate, Kentucky, are ordinary names. People's mothers, people's fathers, couples who had been married for decades. Young people on their first real night out. They were not unlucky in the cosmic sense. They were the people who happened to be in a building that a community had collectively decided to trust, without demanding the kind of accountability that trust required. That is the memory that the Beverly Hills Supper Club leaves behind. Not just the fire, not just the number, not just the smoke and the darkness and the collapsed roof. It leaves behind the question that every single one of us should ask, quietly, every time we walk into a crowded place and feel perfectly safe. Who checked? And what did they find?